Picture a street on a small island off the coast of Tanzania. It's the middle of the night, and instead of being asleep, every house on that street is empty. The families who live there are all outside instead, sitting together around fires they built because they're genuinely sure that being outdoors is safer than being in their own beds. That's not a scene from a movie. That actually happened across an entire island in 1995. Just reason enough that plenty of the people who lived through it are still around to tell you about it themselves. Within a few weeks, police stations were taking statements about it, local government had to respond to it publicly, and at least one man was killed by a crowd that believed he was the cause of it. They call it Popobawa, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why this might be one of the cryptids on this channel that we can't just file away as folklore. We've all heard the stereotypes about mass hysteria, that there's no real substance to it and the actual cause behind it is usually impossible to pin down. But in this case, science tells a much different story. Now, this isn't some campfire retelling or some spread around Reddit post. No, we have real accounts here by real people, real police reports, actual evidence behind this story. We've even got a working paper written by an anthropologist who was living on the island at the time that most of this was occurring. We even have coverage from outlets as mainstream as BBC, posting more than once on this exact story. So, let's break down the evidence and let's start with what people have said was actually happening to them. Let's get into it. Popobawa comes from two Swahili words, popo meaning bat and bawa meaning wing. The legend belongs specifically to Pemba, the smaller, quieter of the two main islands that make up the Zanzibar archipelago. If Unguja, the main island, is the one tourists know for its beaches and stone towns, alleyways, Pemba is the one known for clove plantations and small fishing villages. Not exactly the setting you'd expect for one of the best documented mass panics in modern folklore. Descriptions of the creature vary slightly from person to person, however, there's a consistent thread running through almost every single one of them. By day, it can supposedly pass as an ordinary person, almost like a skinwalker, even someone familiar. By night, it changes. A hunched, gray-skinned figure, bat-like wings, and a single burning eye centered on its forehead. And a smell that witnesses keep independently describing the same way is sulfur. According to the accounts, it enters homes at night, pins the sleeping victim down, and essays them. And then it says something specific. Tell others what happened or I'll come back and it'll be worse. That detail, the demand to spread the story, turns out to matter a whole lot, because every attack is essentially designed to manufacture the next rumor, which is why part of this legend doesn't just spread like a normal ghost story, it almost spreads like an instruction. The pattern of these events can be traced back in Pemba as far back as the 1960s and 70s. It's mostly just scattered local word of mouth, but 1995 is when it stopped being a local rumor and became a regional event. It started on Pemba, but within weeks it had crossed the channel to Unguja and from there reached Dar es Salaam on the Tanzanian mainland. Roughly 30 miles of open water covered entirely by word of mouth and fear, not by any actual creature needing to travel that far. People abandoned their bedrooms. Entire neighborhoods moved outside and slept around communal campfires, a detail that shows up in nearly every first-hand account from that year, and you could still hear it directly from the people who lived through it if you really go looking. And this wasn't just a handful of isolated, unconnected reports either. Police stations recorded a real wave of people coming forward describing the exact same attacker, the exact same method, and in some cases, nearly identical words. Local officials and religious leaders held public meetings specifically to address the panic. The BBC picked it up not once but twice, once in 2001 and then again in 2007, when a second, smaller wave hit. And in the middle of all that, one man a crowd had somehow deemed responsible was killed. That's usually the part that gets skipped whenever someone goes over this, but we're gonna leave it in there. Somebody died purely based off of what people believed was happening around them. Whatever explanation you land on at the end of this video, this part is in no way folklore. That's a documented fact and it deserves to be treated like one. So where does something like this actually come from? Because mass panic doesn't explain itself. Something has to start it. And the honest answer is, there isn't one clean origin story. There are actually two, and they come from completely different directions. The first explanation is folkloric, not actually factual. It's a story that people tell about sometime in the 1970s, a sheik on Pemba summoned a jinn to take revenge on a neighbor he'd fallen out with, and then lost control of it. The jinn finished the job it was sent to do and just kept going. Some versions say it's still doing that work today. The second explanation comes from anthropology, and it's heavier. Zanzibar spent centuries as one of the busiest slave markets on the East African coast. Researchers, as well as anthropologist David Parkin, have argued that Popobawa functions as some kind of inherited social memory, a way of processing that history through a story about being physically violated at night in your own home by something more powerful than you that then forces you to talk about what happened rather than let you hide it. Now, here's where the paper trail gets genuinely interesting, because paranormal writers aren't the only ones who looked into this. Researcher Benjamin Radford, who investigates claims like this professionally, traveled to Zanzibar in 2007 specifically to study the Popobawa, and what he found points towards something a lot more familiar than a monster. Radford's conclusion centers on sleep paralysis, and it's a real, well-documented neurological state where someone regains consciousness before their body does. You're awake, but you can't move and you can't speak. And a striking number of people across totally unrelated cultures with no contact with each other report the same exact add-on to that experience, the tense feeling that someone or something is in the room, pressing down on their chest, hostile and undeniably real. It's the same underlying mechanism behind the old hag of Newfoundland folklore, Kanashibari in Japan, and other European accounts of incubus and succubus visitations. They're all different names with different cultural packaging, remarkably consistent descriptions, because it's very likely the exact same thing interpreted through whatever mythology a given culture already has. What's specific to the Popobawa is the layer sitting on top of that. And it seems that all this activity spikes specifically during political intense stretches, and it always goes quiet in between, which raises an uncomfortable but reasonable question: is Popobawa at least partly a way for collective anxiety about political instability to surface in a form that's much more tangible and easier to say out loud rather than it is in politics? For what it's worth, people who reported actually being attacked tend to reject that theory outright. They'll tell you directly that it has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with what happened to them. That pushback is worth sitting with too, because no matter which underlying cause you find most convincing, the fear itself was never in question. The 1995 wave was real, on the record, and it's covered by outlets with no reason to make it up. So, back to where we started. In July of 1995, an island full of people made a collective decision to sleep outside by fires rather than risk what might be on the other side of their bedroom windows. Maybe that fear was just feeding on itself, maybe it was old trauma finding a new shape to move through, and maybe it is just politically fueled anxiety. Or maybe, and this is the part that's genuinely hard to rule out, enough people on Pemba and Unguja know something about what happened to them that night that no researcher's explanation has fully accounted for yet. If you've been to Zanzibar or you've heard a version of this that's different from what I covered here, please tell me in the comments. This is one of the rare cases where the number of first-hand witnesses actually outpaces the paper trail, and that's a gap that's worth filling in. Anyway, I'm Stu Meat. Thank you for watching. We'll get into the next one soon. Later.